Welcome to this webinar on our article, Advancing Marketing Theory and Practice, Guidelines for Crafting Research Propositions. This article won the 2021 AMS Review Best Paper Award, and we are delighted to share with you today basically two objectives. The first one is we want to discuss with you how we came to developing and writing this article, what's the background here, and also we want to share with you some of the key insights that we developed along the process, and also learnings from starting to use this article in our PhD programs and with other researchers. Now, let me introduce my co-authors. This article was written with my esteemed colleagues, Michael Kleinaltenkamp and Andreas Eggert from the Freie Universität Berlin in Germany, together with Vishal Kashyap from University of Graz in Austria, and then myself, Wolfgang Ulaga at INSEAD on Fontainebleau campus in France. Now, let me start out by turning first to Andreas and ask you, Andreas, actually, what was the point of departure? How did we get to writing this article? Andreas, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Wolfgang. Yeah, actually, both editors and reviewers tend to love research propositions. When you're writing a conceptual article, very often you are asked by your editor, by your reviewers, to come up with a set of research propositions. And many of us made the same experience. And well, as an author, very often you do not really feel comfortable because you do not really know what research propositions actually are and how can you develop a really strong research propositions. So what are research propositions? How are they different from hypotheses? Or is a research proposition just a broader statement, kind of a hypothesis? There must be a difference. So that was the point of departure. We started talking to each other and thought, well, we try to get a better understanding of this fundamental concept of theory building, research propositions, what they are and how they are developed. And Michael, could you walk us through our core figure where we're trying to explain what research propositions actually are and how they relate to the process of theory building?
Yeah, thank you for asking this question, and I would be delighted to do so. So the result basically of our discussion was that we got at least from our perspective, more clarity in terms of what are the building blocks of theory building. And the basic point here, or the basic thing is the concepts that are, so to say, center stage for each theory building. But we have to think that these concepts are embedded in a process or two processes, basically, of theorizing and empiricizing. So each theory building is somehow embedded in terms, in reflections on the theoretical world, where we use theoretical terms, and on the other hand, the empirical terms, or the empirical world, where we use empirical terms in order to describe reality, if so to say. And one of the important starting points for developing research propositions is to have concepts. And these concepts, at least they are abstractions already. So when we as researchers, typically we start with a puzzle, we are irritated by something, we see a problem or we see a phenomenon we haven't thought about, and we want to explain things. We are searching for answers to questions. And in order to do so, we develop in our heads, we develop these concepts, and these concepts are trying to grasp what we are talking about. And this is a very, very important first step in order to develop theory. And there are basically two ways how we as researchers come to these concepts. The one is that there are already existing theoretical lenses through which we look on the world. And these theoretical lenses are described or in foundational premises. So other researchers have developed foundational premises, kind of a spotlight, putting on stage and focusing on certain phenomena. And through these foundational premises, through this lens, we look at the world. And that opens up also the possibility to define certain concepts. let's talk about maybe some examples. So the research advantage theory of Shelby-Hunt, or the service dominant logic of Vargo and Lush. These are examples of theoretical lenses where foundational premises have been formulated that describe a certain way how to look on the world, either when it comes to competition or when it comes to service exchange. And from these premises, we are able to identify and define concepts, resources, for instance. And interestingly, these two lenses I just talked about, these meta-theoretical perspectives, as they are called sometimes, they both talk about resources, but they see the resources in different ways. And that's the reason why the concept of resource in research advantage theory is different from the concept of resource in SDR. But that is always needs to be the starting point.
Okay, great, Michael. So you said when we are building a theory, we are trying to explain the real world, right? So we are building an inner representation, something that is existing just in our mind of how we make sense of reality. And the concepts are our theoretical building blocks, those things that just exist in our mind. Let's say we develop the idea that maybe something like a resource, like a concept like customer engagement might be there. And we use this concept as an inner representation of the outer world. And now we can work with this building block. So in this sense, the concept is really the building block of the theoretical world.
Right.
And the premises, those premises basically define what are those building blocks, right? So that's the major job of a premise, to clearly articulate what are the key building blocks of my theory. When I look at a company, do I see certain coalitions going on? Do I see a transaction cost being minimized? So what are those key concepts that make up my theory, right? And now the next question is, okay, we know what a concept is, we know where it comes from, but what the heck is a research proposition now?
Yeah, the concepts themselves don't make any sense, so to say, for research. Yeah, so they are nice to have. If we think we have an interesting representation of reality in our heads, that doesn't help us to answer the questions we had, of which I was talking in the beginning, to solve the puzzle. For doing this, we need to bring concepts together. So a theory or conceptual model can only be developed by relating concepts. So that means we need to say there is a certain relation between certain concepts. This leads to that. This might have an impact on that. And through this, we become able to explain certain things and to give the answers to the puzzles we have. So as I said, a concept only as a concept in itself is nice to have, but it doesn't help us to answer the questions. And that is the next step that we need to do. So we need to explain in a consistent way, and this is also very important, in a consistent way, how concepts relate to each other. And as soon as we do so, we formulate research propositions. And the sum of the research proposition we have builds the conceptual model. Mm-hmm. So research proposition, maybe just as a definition, they are novel statements specifying relationships between concepts. And these, maybe if I may add, we might come to these research propositions by theoretical reflections. So there is already research in the world, in literature, in journal articles, in textbooks, and we take these theoretical theories that are existing and bring them together in a new research proposition. We find new relationships between maybe old concepts, or maybe between an old concept and a new concept. This would be a research proposition. The other way is we develop those research propositions from empirical research, based in most cases, theories in use. So we ask the managers, what do they think? Because the managers typically have answers to the questions that are interesting, but they are managers, they are now researchers, so they are not able to formulate them in a way that is precise maybe, but they have ideas about the solution of the problems, or they have ideas about how to answer the questions. And then the researchers try to get this knowledge, so to say, out of the heads of the managers or the consumers, and by asking them what they are thinking and bringing this together. And then we can again build new research propositions by connecting new concepts that where there hasn't been maybe even a foundational premises. So they are, so to say, again, also maybe the starting point of a new theory. So basically we have these two ways of developing these research propositions.
Okay, and now we come to the critical question: to what extent is a research proposition different from a hypothesis? Because what you said before, a proposition is somehow linking several entities. That somehow sounds familiar, right? This would also qualify as a nice description of a hypothesis. So to what extent are research propositions really different from hypotheses?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And the answer is these research propositions haven't proven that they are right. So that means we need to somehow test them. But research propositions cannot be tested directly. So this is the reason why if you read a review, in many cases, or you read the instructions of the editors, they ask us to write testable research propositions. And these testable means that there is a possibility to test them. Doesn't mean that they can be tested directly empirically. It means that there should be a possibility to test them. And for doing this, we need to transfer these research propositions into hypotheses. And hypotheses can be tested empirically. And for doing so, we need to have empirical variables that can be observed, measured in reality, so to say, in the empirical world, and where we also can test relationships between these empirical variables. And this is done through the hypotheses. So together, the concepts and the empirical variables build constructs from which we can derive a research model. This is different to a conceptual model. The conceptual model is still in the theoretical world. The research model is on the way, or is in the empirical world, and relates, and this process from concepts to empirical variable. So this is the relation between, so to say, the empirical, the theoretical world and the empirical world. But they need to fit. So this is very important to have these correspondence rules that what we want to measure is really measured, and that these empirical variables are really expressions of the concepts that are the building blocks of our conceptual model.
Okay, so in short, research propositions reside in the theoretical world, and hypotheses are living in the empirical world. Of course, they also draw on the theoretical terms, on the concepts, but they must have also a clear link to the empirical world. So
right.
when we link a concept to an observable empirical variable, now we are building a construct. We are constructing a construct by linking a concept to the empirical world. And now, because now we have operationalized our concept, now we can test them.
Right.
And this is what we are doing when we're not building a theory, but when we're testing.
Right. And this is also the reason why we have the arrow that goes into both directions between the research proposition and the hypotheses, because on the one hand, first, hypotheses are derived from the research propositions, but then when testing the hypotheses, we might see, oh, it doesn't work. So obviously there's something wrong that might lead back to the research propositions, saying the relationships that we, in our theoretical understanding, developed from our theoretical understanding, obviously are not right. They're not correct. We need to adjust them. We need to reformulate them, because the empirical results we have may not fit with these research propositions.
Okay, perfect. So before we come to the probably even more important question, rather than understanding what a proposition is, the even more important question is, how do we develop a really strong proposition. But before we do so, let us very quickly sum up what is a premise, what is a proposition, what is a hypothesis. Can we quickly, just in a nutshell, have those definitions, Michael?
Yeah, here you see them, and this table is also in our paper. So basically, we have these statements. 3 of those. We have the foundational premises, we have the research propositions, and the hypotheses. And these are different types of statements because the foundational premises are statements identifying and defining the core elements of a theoretical perspective or a phenomenon, and the result or the outcome of foundational premises are the concepts. Research propositions are novel statements specifying relationships between concepts, and the result and the outcome of research propositions are a conceptual model. And from that, we can derive hypotheses. These are empirically testable statements specifying main, mediating, and moderating effects between constructs or empirical variables. And this is what is, as an outcome, resulting in a research model.
Okay, great. Now we're ready to go to the next question. How can we develop a really good and strong and novel research proposition? Wolfgang, would you like to share our insights?
Yes, thank you very much, Andreas. And in fact, indeed, one of our main goals in that particular research project was also to think about how can we guide other researchers, help with suggestions and ideas on how to generate those research propositions. And in the process of doing so, we developed a framework that actually ties 4 different aspects or 4 different very important considerations to think about when you want to generate your own research propositions. Now, I want to quickly give you an overview of that. Of course, in the paper, it's developed in much greater detail, but let me hand it over first to Vishal, over to you for this very important first step here in the process of research proposition development and crafting.
Thank you, Wolfgang. As Wolfgang mentioned, this came about through an iterative process even for us. So it's important to perhaps take away that this is a process with multiple steps to it. And the first, really, the initial step in doing this is to ground our research propositions. This essentially means, if you go to the next slide, I guess, Wolfgang, going back and then crafting the research propositions, where you develop the arguments and put them on paper, really, followed by connecting the concepts that Michael and Andreas just discussed in a lot of detail. But we do that based on the evidence that we have in both from the literature, any empirical evidence that exists already, and finally, we look at simplifying and making these propositions accessible to people. So, they're parsimonious, that they make sense, that people intuitively get them. This is important, right? Because you can have these propositions which are obviously complicated enough in the way that they are really straddling some important worlds theoretically, but they are also providing a foundation of how to extend the research, as we'll talk about next. So Wolfgang, if you could please go to the next slide, we can talk about the grounding part. So with regard to grounding, we are really asking researchers to look at forwarding a foundation, something that this house can be built on, and the cornerstone really. And hence, the best possible thing to perhaps do, given that there is a plethora of knowledge out there, is to start small. Start with a small set of research ideas that allow you to really lay out the theory that is emerging. Remember, if you look at the paper's purpose, it's really about developing homegrown theory, more or less, and what might be the role of research propositions in doing that. So what is the emergent theory that you're trying to get across? Key to that, obviously, is logic. How can you build a case, a logical detailed case, which would allow the person who's looking at these propositions to understand what is going on underneath all of your theoretical underpinnings. Now, the nicest, the coolest, the most novel ones are obviously the ones that, in terms of research propositions, the ones that challenge what we know in terms of conventional wisdom. Perhaps one of the ways, one of the barometers of that would be to identify areas where we don't have a lot of existing theory that speaks to the problem at hand. So that does make a difference. You're providing or identifying certain conditions where extent theory really doesn't have a lot to say about. So that makes a lot of sense. Suffice to say that nuances are critical. Whenever something is novel, you could get in the weeds, getting the nuances and identifying those nuances as to when do these conditions hold, when do these conditions really not hold. And doing so would also mean that you are not necessarily just telling the reader what they already know, meaning that if these relationships have already been stated in the existing literature, the goal is to advance it. So you are not going, you would ideally not, as a researcher interested in developing research propositions, you're ideally not interested in restating what we already know. And that brings us to the next step of crafting the research propositions that my colleague Wolfgang will touch base on a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vishal. So you see, the first important point has been grounding. And then once you firmly ground your ideas, then of course you want to think about how can I craft, how can I formulate these propositions in a sharp way. And the important issue here is to spend a substantial amount of time to really think through how can I carefully, in a proper, adequate way, specify these research propositions. Now, it's important to come back to the key concepts here and also the interrelationships. If you remember, Michael and Andreas were insisting on this very important step here. And also including these propositions as a key part of the contribution of the article that you're going to develop. Now, it's very important in that step as well to think about what kind of logical argumentation will I roll out for the reader that systematically builds on each argument in such a way that the reader can see how the proposition emerges. Sometimes, we get these reviewer comments that the proposition comes out of nowhere. We don't really see where it roots, where it sets its roots in, how is it being developed. So it's very important actually to not only to put the proposition forward, but to clearly showcase where and how it has taken shape and form in the process of writing it. So that's the step number 2. And then there's a third important step. Let me go back to Vishal here and let's look together at the step number 3. Oh, we can't hear you.
Sorry. Sorry about that. I'll start with what the goal is of this entire exercise. We are trying to get an effective set of parsimonious propositions. So how do we get there? We researchers who are interested in formulating these propositions should not ignore, we are not restating whatever exists, but we are not ignoring whatever exists in terms of the evidence that we have, whether it's theoretical, whether it's empirical evidence. So what that does essentially is it allows us to weave a really nice net where you can, as a researcher, really expound on the reasons why these concepts are tied together. Why should they be tied together? When you ignore whatever exists, you might have there might be a reinventing of the wheel, and which is what you do not want to do. So you ideally would sort of look at all the evidence. You pay close attention. You pay close attention for these novel effective propositions to whether these these things further on down the line, these propositions, can they be empirically operationalized? Can they be tested? Because, you know, that would be one of the ways where you can build and provide the foundations for future research to build off of these propositions. One of the papers that we talk about, which has really motivated decades, 3 decades of research, is obviously the famous paper by Coley and Jaworski on marketing orientation, where they talk about, you know, they provide a wonderful way of how this process is carried out. In our paper, we discussed this paper in a lot more detail, and I would urge you to go visit our paper to see how this works out. But suffice to say that we all know how Coley and Jaworski has influenced our work, or has been influential in motivating a stream of research. And finally, if we are looking at parsimony as the goal, we should probably look at how many propositions. You know, we don't necessarily throw the kitchen sink at it. We try to look at the numbers of propositions where we see some underlying commonality, some threads, some themes that tie these propositions together. And when you go through this exercise, and, you know, suffice to say that this is not a one-off, you're more likely to end up with a parsimonious set of propositions. Wolfgang will talk about how to then finally simplify, which is our final step in this particular process of how to simplify these propositions. Over to Wolfgang.
Yeah, and that's where a little bit of an artwork and taking a step back comes into the game here. You have the keyword already on the slide. It's about parsimonious set of propositions, and that's why we come to this last step of simplifying, right? We want to make sure that this doesn't look like a very complex edifice that it's very hard to penetrate and understand. On the contrary, the beauty of it is, of course, sometimes when you see it at the end, it seems evident, it stands there, and the propositions all come together and make sense. But that's exactly what we want to get at, right? So we want to make these propositions easily accessible to readers. We want to avoid any complicated formulations. We want to make it as crisp, as clear, as concise, as consistent as we can. We want to make sure that terminology and labels are clear. Editors and reviewers, they really don't like it when, you know, notions are not clear. Multiple interpretations can be coming out of this. You know, the propositions are not clearly separated from each other. These are all alarm bells that go off, and you want to make sure that you really put an extra effort here into that particular stage. And that's where also sometimes, or actually oftentimes, it's very helpful to guide the reader with visual support, visual assistance, thinking about not only the what, but also the how will I explain these propositions to the reader. And that's where visualization oftentimes is a very, very powerful tool. You show the boxes and the arrows, so to say, so that people get the idea and also see how this building is really, really coming together. Think of an architect. An architect develops a very, very clear explanation, a very clear mock-up, so to say, of what he or she wants to present, and we are doing something very similar. So these are the 4 steps. And now, of course, once you have thought through these ramifications here, there is another important topic that we address in the article, which is to think about how do we actually evaluate the relevance and the rigor of those research propositions. How do you really make sure that the outcome is the best possible outcome that you want to aim for? And again, here in our article, we develop another framework. We call it the 4 C's. Clarity, consistency, conciseness, and contribution, just to help you as a researcher to have some guidance on how can I get the most mileage out of that particular stage. Now, again, we want to keep it very concise, but we want to just give you a highlight for each of those 4 stages. The first one, clarity. Let me hand it over to you, Vishal, again, to help us a little bit understand, how do we ensure that we have done our best possible job to make this very clear and understandable, as unambiguous as possible? Vishal, over to you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. As Wolfgang mentioned, the idea of this 4Cs framework is really to allow a researcher to best evaluate the resulting set of research propositions that emerges from the framework that we just proposed. The first step, and this could be a feedback loop that a researcher could go through this and say, oh, I don't meet this specific point or this specific idea of clarity, then what could I potentially do? So we really wanted to offer the researcher interested in crafting propositions some ways to evaluate how they could enhance the effectiveness of their research propositions, and how they could evaluate if these research propositions were effective. The first one is very simple. How unambiguous, how coherent are these propositions? How do they tie unambiguously concepts, the relationships that Michael and Andreas talked about, in a very simple, unambiguous manner? No two ways about it. Once you get there, because then people could start poking holes in your argumentation, and that's what you would like to avoid, doing that. The next step, as my colleague Wolfgang will take over, is explicate on, is about consistency of these propositions. Over to you, Wolfgang.
Yeah, so here the idea about consistency is to think, to what extent are these research propositions systematically related and especially internally coherent, right? Sometimes you see research propositions, when you start reading them, it doesn't fit to each other. Think of it like a Lego, where all the bricks have to come together, they have to fit into each other, and the picture has to emerge. So somebody who reads those research propositions must be able to see this picture building up. And here's oftentimes where you see sometimes inconsistencies, things that are difficult to understand, maybe sounding contradictory to each other. And that's very important to hash out. How can this be solved when these things occur? Vishal, the third one, over to you.
Yeah, in terms of conciseness, this goes back to that principle that we have been, that has been hammered into our heads when we were in our doctoral educations, I guess, as researchers. The principle of parsimony. So how are these propositions? Are they parsimonious enough? Do they capture the breadth and depth of everything, but they're not so long-winded that you lose the reader? And that in and of itself, as Wolfgang mentioned, is an art. Meeting the principle of parsimony, novel, effective propositions that are accessible to the reader. And one of the ways that could be done essentially is writing parsimonious propositions. Now, that sounds very easy. I can assure you that I have tried this, and it takes a few takes. You can do it, but it really requires you to focus on ideas that might seem evidently clear to you because you're in the weeds on these things, but are not as clear to the outside reader. So do remember and keep in mind that when you're developing these propositions, that are your propositions parsimonious? Are they meeting that bar of parsimony? And then finally, the idea of contribution, which Wolfgang will talk about a little bit.
Yeah. And conciseness, I would say there's very practical things. Give it in the hands of others. Get somebody else to look at it and ask, is this concise enough? Can you do it even in a more concise way? Go back to it multiple times. So there's lots of different ways of getting there. Now, contribution, of course, that's the ultimate measurement here. To what extent are the propositions really making a contribution, a substantial contribution to theory and managerial practice? It's kind of the ultimate question, right? Are we moving the needle in both areas? And in terms of theory, of course, the evident question to be asked is, are we making a truly substantial, lasting, novel contribution? And that's where you really have to ask the hard question, you know, why do we need this research proposition? What will it contribute to theory? And is this big enough, substantial enough? And then, of course, from a managerial perspective, you know, as our dear colleague A.G. Coley often likes to say, he says, you know, is this making a manager change his or her managerial action? Will people do things differently once looking at these propositions and the outcomes of these propositions? So are we actually influencing, in other words, decision makers about their attitudes, about their behaviors, about their actions? Will that actually bring a change? And if the answer is no, then we might go back to the drawing board and think about it hard. If the answer is yes, we have a really good candidate in hand. So in a long story short, we develop 4 guidelines, 4 interesting ways, lenses of looking at are we really on the right track with our research propositions. Now, with that, we almost come to the end of our webinar, of our overview of this article. We don't want to close it before taking a final step back. We've seen now some of the key aspects of our ideas in our article. It has been actually very rewarding to see the many interesting responses already, feedback, emails we received from colleagues. It resonates apparently very, very well with many researchers. At least that's what we see already from these many reactions. Now, I want to hand it over back to my colleagues again. We have some first experiences here, and let's go maybe first back to Vishal, to you, over what to do with this article when we think about stakeholders and what they could potentially do with our article. Vishal, over to you.
Thank you, Wolfgang. The purpose of this article was to sort of navigate choppy waters that we ourselves have meandered onto many a time. And one of the things which I thought was very interesting was initially to figure out, okay, does the fact that we don't have we are not familiar with this process, this has to translate into PhD students, early career researchers, even established marketing scholars, and other stakeholders such as university administrators, journal reviewers, journal editors. What are some things that they could do with this process? And I think what it does, Wolfgang, is it really gives all of these, and this is not an exhaustive set. These are just the lowest hanging fruit. The group of, as we call them, creators and the people who are basically advancing marketing theory and evaluators. So the people who are evaluating marketing theory, and those are the gatekeepers, so to speak, in journals, maybe university P&T tenure committees, administrators, etc., which I think my colleagues would obviously like to perhaps add and help me out here. But it's really to give them something to hold on to, that they actually have a set of guidelines. And as Wolfgang mentioned, the reactions that we have been getting, informal in many cases, that people are being helped by this process. And we would love to sort of hear back from you about how you would do that. But I'm sure that my colleagues have already tested it out. I know Professor Eggert has tested it out in the classroom, and he's had some reactions to the process as well. I think Professor Kleinaltenkamp has also had some experience with presenting this in various forums, and he's had some very interesting reactions as well. So I'll hand over to perhaps Professor Eggert to give us his opinion on how this has resonated or not with the crowd he has presented it to, or the crowds.
Yeah, thank you, Vishal. I actually used this paper in a PhD class that is called Approaches to Business Research, that is bringing together people from different areas, from strategy, from marketing, from human resources. And the idea of this PhD class is to talk about the building blocks of theory. So how can we build a theory? What is a concept, and so on? And what really resonated well with the participants, with PhD students here in this class, was the kind of clarity that we provided by saying, look, this is how we define a proposition. This is the extent to which a premise is different from a proposition. And this is the empirical level that is distinguishing the proposition from the hypothesis. And also being quite clear about the difference between a concept that resides in your brain, in the theoretical world, and a construct that is linking your ideas and thoughts to the observable world. So making a very clear distinction between a concept and a construct. And those two terms are very often being used interchangeably in the literature. So we offer one way how you can clearly delineate those terms, and that was pretty well received in this PhD class. Michael, over to you. And you need to unmute yourself.
True, yes, and I would like to add some reactions I received from also experienced researchers who said that they are really using this article now as a guideline for writing a paper. And I think the three parts we have in it. We have on the one hand, what you just said, the building blocks that are important for theory building, for writing conceptual articles. And we have these two processes of developing the research propositions and evaluating them. And this is what every researcher needs to do when writing an article. So this is also can on the one hand be a guideline from starting an article, but we all know when writing articles, this is always a development. Yeah, we go in this direction, sometimes we go in that directions, and we have written something, then we hand it over to colleagues, and then it's on the desk, and 2 days later we start again and thinking of it. So, and these guidelines help us, I think, to reflect on our work. Yeah, and so, okay, where are we now? What have we done? Are we really in a way to formulate these research propositions in a proper way? There are not too many, they are consistent to each other, and all these kind of things just help us. Also, experienced researchers help us to make our papers better, I think. And this is what we can do to make our research better. And as I said, I already received some reactions from colleagues from around the world who was very positive with this article and said, I now use it for writing my paper, and thanks for doing this. So this is a very nice reaction that you can receive as authors of a paper.
Yeah, absolutely. You couldn't better conclude, Michael, with these remarks. Let me just say, the starting point was, we all talk about research propositions. We say it's very important for theory development, but oftentimes people ask, where and how do I find guidance for actually doing it? And we all know that sometimes people shy away from it. They just don't include research propositions because they feel uncomfortable with it and they don't know exactly how to do it. And that would be a shame. So long story short, our goal was really to set the foot forward to help everyone in our discipline to collectively advance. And we do hope that this article, it's a small step, but hopefully a step in the right direction to help marketing and marketing theory move forward. So please, as the slide here says, don't hesitate to write us. We would love to hear from you about reactions, experiences, maybe using the article. And hey, write us when your first research proposition has been published in one of the marketing journals. We would proudly hang it over our desks to remind us that it really has been helpful. With that, let me stop here. Let us stop here. We thank you for your attendance to this webinar, for looking at it, and we do hope it helps you in the future. Merci beaucoup. Vielen Dank. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everyone.